Thank you all for coming tonight. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. I'm Kathy Maloney. I'm the president of the Frederick Law Olmsted Society, and the Society, in conjunction with the library, is hosting this lecture tonight. We host a number of different lectures throughout the year, most of them pertaining to nature or historic things or environmental things. So thank you so much for coming out. I want to thank Brett and Lois, who helped put this lecture together, and give a little plug for the Olmsted Society. How many of you are familiar with the Society? Terrific. So, out on our website, we have a couple of upcoming events. We have some landscape work days. The Society helps the village in planting some of the natural areas. Something we'll be doing in October 13th, Saturday, October 13th, will be seed collecting. So if you ever wanted to know how to collect seed from native plants, join us then. Again, go out on the website and take a look at it. We have another lecture coming up October 11th, and that's going to be about Brookfield Zoo, the history of it, and the new things that they're planning right now. So we hope you can come to that. And lastly, how many folks are on Facebook, one way, shape, or form? A couple of you. If you could, we're putting, the Olmsted Society has a survey out right now. We want to know, we've been around for 50 years, and we think, well, maybe we can do some things maybe a little different, see what's working and what's not working. So if you see the survey on Facebook, takes 5 minutes, let us know how we're doing and how you like our programs. Tonight we're going to be talking about birds and about gardens. How many folks here are gardeners? Okay, and how many are birders or like birds? There's some overlap, isn't there? And we have the perfect person tonight who's going to talk about it. You may know that Riverside is an area that attracts a lot of birds, both migratory and resident, largely because of our natural areas, the river and the vegetation that surrounds the river. And so there's an effort underway to get Riverside certified as what the Audubon Society calls an important bird area. And that's a couple-year process. There are just some volunteers who are going out during the migratory seasons in spring and fall and documenting what birds we see. So if you would like to join that, let me know afterwards, let Melinda know. There's some folks here who are doing it. It's very ad hoc. I am not a good bird identifier, but I can tell people where I see stuff moving and then they identify it for me. So that's something that we're trying to do. Somebody who knows everything about birds is my friend and our colleague, Melinda Pruett-Jones, who will be speaking with us tonight. Melinda is an ornithologist by training, and she has over 35 years of experience working in organizations that are committed to conservation, both formal and informal science education. She is the executive director of the American Ornithological Society. And prior to joining that society, she served as the executive director of Chicago Wilderness and was the founding chair of the Metropolitan Green Spaces Alliance. She worked for the Field Museum and for the Chicago Zoological Society. And if you ever see her garden, it's beautiful. And humans think so, and the birds think so too. So I hope you'll welcome Melinda, and she's got a lot to tell us, and I look forward to her presentation as well. Here's Melinda.
Thank you, Kathy. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Our neighbors, lots of neighbors in the neighborhood say they can always tell when they're coming near the Pruett-Jones' house because they can hear the birds before they can see the house. And that's through years and years of basically creating a habitat for them in and around our house. So I'm going to be kind of talking about the process for that and the inspiration. And obviously, as you just pointed out, you're gardeners and you love birds, and so I'm going to step us through kind of how you bring those two together. And I should ask first, how many people are doing native gardening now? Okay, well, you could come up here and join me and talk about this. Great. So I'm going to start with sort of the big picture view. This is the Chicago Wilderness region, and the green highlights there are the green infrastructure, so basically the interconnected lands and waters that make up our mosaic of habitats that are so important for wildlife in our region. Lake Michigan is part of the larger Central Flyway, but this is called the Lake Michigan Flyway, that the birds coming through our region end up either visiting, staying to breed, or moving on. And we're going to talk a little bit about migration, the grand phenomenon of birds flying by the millions and millions. In fact, we get about 5 million birds flying through here every year in the spring and the fall. And of course, a lot of people are just completely unaware of it. But they are here, and they tend to arrive on the southerly winds in the spring and very erratic during the fall. And from their point of view, they've just flown over this huge desert of corn and soybean. And they arrive at the southern end of Lake Michigan. And it's interesting, some species go up through Michigan, and other species come through the Chicago region. And through a bunch of studies, we know that some of these birds actually prefer to fly along the lakefront. And there are certain species that only fly there, and then there are other species that fly inland a bit or away from the lake, and those are the ones that come up through Riverside and through our area. I've circled the area around Riverside and the whole Salt Creek drainage on the Des Plaines River. So the birds that are coming through here, that's about 10,000 years or more of hardwired migration patterns. They anticipate and they need the woodlands, the prairies and grasslands, the different water elements. They'll stop and they'll fuel up, or they'll come and they will stay to breed. But what they're queuing in on is that critical habitat. There's a whole science to understanding the migratory stopover sites. And I can boil it down into really simple, very simple phrases. That they're looking for the big, large landscapes, sort of the Costco big box store, where they can get everything they need. Some of those are circled, the pink areas where there's lots of canopy cover. Then there's the intermediate landscapes. And they're the 7-Elevens or the convenience stores. They're in a smaller landscape, and sometimes they're corridors, or they're smaller spaces that are sort of connected with corridors. And then finally, there's the small pockets of green. They could be parks, they can be your backyard. They're what we call a fire escape. I mean, birds will just drop down out of exhaustion, they'll pick up what they need, and then they'll probably move on to a larger area where they might stay a couple of days and fuel up. But all of these are very important. They all play a role, and so what happens in your yard is just as important for these migratory birds in particular than the big areas. It all fits together. The Des Plaines River and Salt Creek confluence, which we're in the middle of, I've circled the Riverside area. In the middle, you can see when Kathy was describing, we talked about we're trying to get Riverside designated as an important bird area. It's already in the middle of an important bird area, but the data had never been collected here in terms of the birds that occur, and so we're collecting that information and hoping to complete the whole area as an important bird area. And it is a very beautiful, lovely place for birds flying through that inland passageway to come through here. And they've got this is what you'd call a big convenience store for them to stay in. So it's an important stopover site. So then there's Riverside. You can see, I think, how much green there is. As Kathy was saying, we have a lot of nature. We have a lot of connected nature. We've got an urban forest. We've got natural areas along the river. And then we've got what's happening in the yards. Most of the properties in Riverside have front and back yards, and the birds use all of it. This is also we talk about the history of Riverside as being the first designed community in the United States. It's also the first conservation designed community in the United States. It's 50% green. It's walkable. It's really about the connection of people and nature, and so it's a great backdrop for us to be exploring native landscaping and bringing nature into our backyards in order to attract wildlife and support them. So I'll talk a little bit about the diversity of birds in our region. If you're thinking about how to attract birds to your yard, you need to know, well, what are the different types of birds that might be coming there. So first we'll talk about the year-round residents. As most of you being birders, you could probably name off 2 or 3 just off the top of your head. How about a couple of
Sparrows.
sparrows? Which ones?
House sparrows.
House sparrows, okay. Others? Cardinals. Others? Chickadees, great.
White-breasted nuthatch.
Great, okay, exactly. So these are birds that are here year-round. They don't move. They may have territories that they establish and defend during the breeding season. Those tend to break down, and they might flock up and be moving around the community during the winter, but they're here year-round. We've got lots of great woodpeckers and hawks and all sorts of things. You've got the whole cycle, the whole food chain there. We also have migrants that are breeders here. And so they can be long-term migrants coming from South America, or they can be shorter-term migrants just coming from southern states. But they move north for the food productivity in this region for their breeding, and they're here early in the spring. They get busy, and they're usually gone by this time of the year. And then third, we have the migrants that are passing through. So this is a very diverse group of birds. It's everything from huge sandhill cranes and hawks to the tiniest songbirds, and even and our little hummingbirds. Our hummingbirds, they're both breeding birds here, but many of them go way up further north to the boreal forest to breed. So the Chicago region is really, really important, being between I'd say the southern part of the U.S. and then the boreal forest to the north, so that these birds have really cued into the habitats and the productivity of the Great Lakes. And what's great about Chicago region is, yes, there's 9 million people here. We have industry, we have lots of cement, lots of impermeable surface, lots of roadways, lots of buildings, but we also have lots of nature. So when you think about Cook County, and how many people were here 2 weeks ago for the talk about the forest preserves? So like for example, just in Cook County alone, the natural areas devoted designated as forest preserves is about 11% of the land cover for Cook County. We have a tremendous amount of nature here, and it's very important for all these native species that are utilizing this region. So the birds are focusing on landscape. This is what brings them here. The native plants produce these bugs and these berries and all these things that they depend on. And so the objective, in terms of attracting them to your homes and to your yards and to enjoy them for a much closer view, much more intimate experience, is to replicate this in your yards. So designing yards for your birds is really about planting for diversity. So you're looking for a diversity of size and growth patterns of your trees and your shrubs. you're looking for variable height from small trees to tall trees, from big, large trunked trees to very small ones, evergreen and deciduous. So some of the trees lose their leaves, and they're very important for birds at certain times of the year, and not so important other times of the year. Evergreens are really important for so many different species, and you basically need both. You also want to plant, or you want to think about designing your garden in terms of what's blooming, what's producing berries, what's producing food or attracting food to it throughout the year. And then the density is also important. Birds in particular need a lot of cover. And so if everything is beautifully spaced out and you've got everything measured nicely, the birds are just going to feel that maybe that's a little too risky. So when you think about clumping and density, it's really important for the birds. And basically what you're doing is you're mimicking nature. And you can be as creative or let it be as wild as possible as you like. So, because many of you do natural landscaping already, how many of you are I like it to fit in my garden and keep it under control? So more of a formal. I would say you're riotous. And how many are riotous in their native? Yes. But I mean, it could be like my yard, just everywhere, and because leave it up all winter long, it just reseeds itself, and it's constantly creeping and moving. Or you can contain it, and it can be in a very prescribed part of your yard. Or parts of your yard. There could be little pockets of prairie and little pockets of woodland and little pockets of, all sorts of things. So it's really not difficult to work with them. It's just how you design the natives into your yard, and then kind of making the choice about how much time you want to be maintaining them. And there's lots of ecosystem services that come from native plants. I mean, when you think about the ecosystem services that this community, Riverside, receives from all the natural areas we have in terms of keeping water on the landscape, creating lots of corridors for wildlife. We see so much wildlife here. My first wild beaver was here in Riverside. And this is, after 30-something years of, being a biologist. So there's lots of wildlife that comes through here and or lives here, and then also by creating bringing natives into your landscape, you are basically creating an ecosystem in your yard that is an extension of the broader ecosystem in your community. And then the benefits to the garden are many. A lot of people talk about native landscaping being lower maintenance. I think that's debatable. I would say it's a lot of work, but there are things about a native landscape that require your attention, and then other things, don't come into play. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Lower cost, particularly if you're letting your plants reproduce themselves and moving them around and seeing what works and sharing them, or sharing your compost, or sharing whatever. I mean, how many people swap with their neighbors and their friends? And like you have this open door policy, bring your shovel and take, And so, I mean, that's kind of the culture, obviously, of people that do native landscaping and want to promote that with their friends. Definitely less water use. In my yard, if it requires water, it doesn't live there, and I let them sort themselves out in terms of what's going to survive in my yard and what's not. Obviously, it attracts native diversity. I would say, in particular, it is about the bugs. For birds, it's really about the bugs. Berries too, but particularly bugs. And as you all, I'm sure, appreciate, it really connects you to nature. And it's an incredible opportunity to see these birds behaving and interacting, and the predator-prey relationship that takes place in your yard, because you're creating a habitat that birds can really use. And then I also want to say something about the long view, that it's always a work in progress. Do I see a lot of nodding heads? Yes. I mean, I remember when I first participated in conservation at home, which we'll talk about later, the coordinator said, it's always a work in progress. And that was absolutely the best thing to hear from the very beginning, because it is still progress. It's not there yet. It'll never be there. Your needs as a homeowner are going to change. And so the garden is going to need to change. Your kids might be growing up, or your grandchildren are coming in, and all sorts of different things are happening. Your tastes change. I loved this particular plant for the longest period of time. Now it's taking over everything. You're out of here. You're making those decisions all the time. Your yard changes. Our oaks have gotten so big now that I basically have a shade garden with a little bit of sun in the front. And it's interesting because the sun's my little pocket prairie, because it's where they tipped all of the soil when they dug out the basement of our house, and it doesn't drain, it doesn't behave like any of the other soil in my entire yard. So, okay, that's where those plants go. But pretty soon that's going to be shady, and we'll see what happens. Birds will disperse plants into your yard. Your neighbor's plants will blow into your yard, as will the weeds and everything else. And so your yard is always changing, and so that's just I think that's just par for the course. I'm sure everybody here feels strongly about the war on invasive plants. Yes, so keep it up. I know that it's, sometimes you have to pick your battles, and right now, I've won the war on buckthorn, and I've won the war on garlic mustard, and at least in my little place, but I cannot win the war yet on ivy. So I'm trying to work with ivy if I can. So those are the sorts of things. I know that all of you make those decisions. So it is a work in progress, and never get discouraged.
When the ivy covers your window, you've lost.
Yeah, well, it's true, because then you get, exactly. So best practices. My yard is a drug-free yard. To be able to let go of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, to just try to work with all sorts of organic materials. You're going to get the best results, and you're going to protect the birds. The birds bioaccumulate. You'd think, well, wait a minute, these are little songbirds. This isn't a peregrine falcon. This is how can a little bit of insecticide hurt? It's so ephemeral. It's so fast. It's gone. Well, like for example, house wrens. How many people have house wrens nesting or visiting their yards? They love spiders. Spiders are a huge sink as a non-target species for insecticides. Wrens eat those spiders, kills the wrens. So you're always, by making that choice, you're really embracing the fact that you're trying to create a habitat for these birds to come in. Well, then the last thing you want to do is have them come in and then kill them through the herbicide and insecticide use that you're using. So those are contraindicated, I guess I would say. Reducing your lawn. How many people have been working slowly to reduce their lawns? Brilliant. And how many are trying to mow it a little bit higher? And that's so important, because there's so much important bird food in that higher grass. And it's a lot easier on you. And then using rain as a resource. How many people are using rain barrels? And it just depends on your property and if your house, if that works, but certainly, your downspouts going off into your garden and using diffusers, they're just super simple solutions that are so effective. But I love having the water to then water my plants that I say, if you can't live without water, you don't live in my yard. But I help the newcomers with stuff from the rain barrel. So basically, they say if you build a native garden, animals will come, birds will come. And for birds in particular, what you're looking for is the shelter cover. So again, when you talk about density and strata and all these different elements of your environment, very important, cover. You're trying to create food. You're basically developing a food court for your birds. And different birds need different types of food, so you need to diversify what you're offering. And then nesting habitats. Some birds nest very low. Some birds nest at the sort of eye level. Like I can never understand why this catbird family comes back every year. It's like right in my eyes at the hedge between me and my neighbor, right where you open the door, and it's of the car, as you're getting out of the car. But that's where they like it, and so. And then other birds that are nesting in your taller trees and in nesting in nest holes and certainly nest boxes. And then providing sources of water. How many people are using water on their landscape? Little ponds, bird baths, great. That is critical, absolutely critical. I see more birds in our pond than probably anywhere else in the yard. And that's year-round too. So here's some of our breeding birds of the region. Which one here is the resident bird? Woodpecker, very good. Who's up here on the top left? All right. Who's just below it? Great crested flycatcher. They're starting to really, their populations are growing here, which is great. They like big bugs. So, it's great to attract them. They will nest in a nest box a little higher up, big box, and they're great to have in your property. They're one of the most beautiful calls. You all know the oriole, I know. So that nest is a robin's nest, usually the first thing that you're going to see in the spring in terms of nests. And then there's that little wren eating a spider. Right. So planting for seasons. I am not at all good at this. If somebody is particularly good at and successful in planting for seasons, you should be jumping in this section. In the spring, you're thinking about plants that are going to be blooming early. Trees, shrubs, flowers. And this is particularly important for birds like thrashers and thrushes. Anything that you can find that's going to work in your garden. Sometimes these are the smaller trees. And then the nectar-producing flowers. In particular, the flowers are so important for the migratory birds because whether it's a flowering tree or a flowering shrub or a flower, they're attracting insects early, and the birds are cueing in on that. In addition, in spring, I think everybody understands, or probably everybody knows, the importance of our oak woodlands during spring migration. This is what really supports some of these long-range migrants that are going further north. Leaves haven't fully leafed out yet. They don't have their protective tannins, and they're covered with insects. And that's what our migratory birds are trying to cue in on as they come into the region. Well, what's interesting with the changes in our climate, there is a phenology mismatch with the time that the birds are innately responding to day length in South America and start moving north, and they come here, and they do fly, they're volant, and so if they've missed the the right window with our oaks. They'll either go right over, they'll usually just go right over, or they'll hang out for a little while and try different substrates for finding insects. In summer, fruiting plants, they're just such an important staple for birds that are breeding here, both residents and ones that are traveling in. Serviceberry, black cherry, blueberry, elderberry, milkweed, it's in the wrong spot there, perennial wildflowers. Milkweed is becoming more and more important for birds and hummingbirds. And it's just an interesting thing about what's happening for our region. And then the perennial wildflowers, I'm sure all of you have your favorites, whether they're cone flowers or they're coreopsis or they're penstemons or whatever. You pick your favorite variety. These are all really important during the summer and obviously into the fall, because if you're leaving these plants up in order to provide food for the migrants as they're coming back down in the fall, and then of course also into the winter. So fruiting plants, again, very important for the for fall migrants. Right now the choke cherries should be just dripping with birds, and so be thinking about fruit. I mean, I think most of us think about insects, but fruit is so important. And then the perennials that are producing seeds, leave them up and let them stand. It's true with your grasses and your shrubs. I mean, if you do like a neat and tidy garden, that's great, but leave little bits up for both your interests and for the birds. In the winter also, water is just as important as it is in the summer, in the spring, the fall. And little bird bath heaters work really well, or if you have a small pond, if you have an aerator in there, that it will generally not freeze over. The nest boxes, a lot of people take them down because they've learned we're supposed to take them down and clean them out and put them away. And actually you want to take them down, clean them out, and put them back up, because they are so important for birds that overwinter here. So one bird that we're seeing more and more here in Riverside, and I'm sure just all this part of Cook County, is the Carolina wren. And it does overwinter here. And as things get warmer, it's going to probably do better. But when we have a hard winter, they don't survive. So like last summer, or last year, we had lots of breeding pairs in the first division of Riverside. This year we had none. And it was a hard winter and they didn't make it through, and hard at the wrong time. So those nest boxes back out in the winter are fun to look at, and they actually provide spots for birds. And then woodies. When I talk about woodies, this is piles of sticks. And you can make beautiful arrangements around your trees, and you can make maypoles, and you can make all, think of it as art, but it is so important for birds. I'm not suggesting you just have, sticks everywhere, but those woodies are so important. Bird feeders. Bird feeders are good year-round. It's fine. It's important to keep them very clean. You need to place them close to your windows. Seems counterproductive, but that reduces bird collisions. You definitely want to give some space around your bird feeders so that there's no cover for predators underneath, particularly cats. And then a lot of people say, well, I don't like to have my feeders out because it attracts hawks, and hawks eat birds. And I would say, well, that's a circle of life that is quite okay. And they have the accipiters, the bird hawks, the Cooper's hawks have plenty to eat, and they're not only queuing in on your bird feeders. Hazards. I know everybody knows this is the number one hazard for birds in today. More than collision. There's 1 billion birds that are killed in collisions with windows, but cat's the #1 killer. So keep your cat inside. And in terms of window collisions, you're building this habitat in your yard, near your home. You're trying to get away from the football field of grass and a couple of foundational plantings. So you're building this beautiful habitat, but then you've got all these reflective surfaces that kill birds. So trying to figure out how to use bird tape or any sorts of things that help the birds see the window. Eventually when we next replace our windows, there'll be the technology that window can be seen by birds. They see in the UV, and they can put UV reflectant material in the windows, and that is all the birds need to see to go, oh, that's a wall, that's not something to fly through. So again, position your feeders close to the windows.
When would that be available?
It's starting to become available now. There's actually a very interesting article that just came out in Audubon magazine about it. And it's in the future, definitely. I think that the collisions we think that, well, okay, I hear a couple, but I don't think I have a lot of impact. You'd be surprised at how many birds lose their lives flying into our windows. So getting started, this is a very educated crowd, so I'm not going to get into this. You're already swapping, you're doing all sorts of things. But I do want to say that for you to, if you do want to learn more, or you really want somebody to come and assess your yard, give you very direct feedback about what you're doing and what your goals are, I really recommend Conservation at Home. This is sponsored by the Conservation Foundation. Cook County has now adopted this. It would be great if Riverside adopted this as their sort of go-to community service to learn about doing native landscaping. How many people are familiar with Conservation at Home? Great. They have a workshop on October 27th that is at Sagawa, and which is Lamont. It's a beautiful forest preserve down in the Palos area. And I think you could learn so much from them and connect with other people that are learning and gathering. Their focus is on the plants, less about birds, but they're very, very knowledgeable people, and so could help you with your questions as well. So I recommend that as your next step. And thank you.
I know you must have questions. If you'll just raise your hand, I'll give you this mic. It won't amplify your voice, but it's for the video. So does anybody have questions for Melinda? Here's one.
Just an insight. We have some hawks that seem to come around each year and raise young in a large old tree that we have in back. And this past year, and this happened to me maybe about 20 times, the hawk is actually, and it doesn't do it when I'm facing the hawk, just when my back is to the hawk. It'll actually strafe me. And it's done that about 20 times. And again, if I'm looking at the hawk, it won't do it. But I turn my back on the hawk very intelligently. It comes down. I've actually felt it go through my hair. Insights on that?
It's got a nest.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very that's a very typical behavior of a bird with an active nest. It could be. My favorite story was in the evening on Easter one year. I went outside at dusk and I got whacked in the head, and I'm like, what was that? And it was a saw-whet owl. And the babies had just come out of the nest. So it could be, and you're saying that this is a bird that is there year-round, or sorry, throughout the season, or?
No, not throughout the season. It is there. It's gone now. It's been gone maybe perhaps 3-4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But it had been there month and a half perhaps.
Okay, yeah, so it's probably nesting. And sometimes this will happen too, where they're moving through with the babies, and they're all roosting in one tree, and you just happen to be walking in your yard, minding your own business, and yeah. So the fact that they didn't hit you is good.
Other questions? Got one here.
You mentioned sandhill cranes, that migrate through the area. Are there any places around here where the sandhill cranes land and, you can look at them from a distance?
Jasper Pulaski State Park.
That's in Indiana, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm talking around here.
Okay, so let me, if I could just take a moment to talk about this very interesting migration pattern of the sandhill crane populations that are recovering, and we're getting bigger and bigger numbers. The migration pattern in their central flyway is really interesting because they have staging sites first, then they go to stopover sites, and then as they get south of their stopover sites, everything sort of breaks down, and they just sort of go off into different directions. So the staging is taking place in Wisconsin right now, and so family groups are flying into the Wisconsin River and these spots where you might get 300 birds, 400 birds. And so the closest would be like up in Baraboo and places like that where you're going to see birds in that number. So we don't have, that I'm aware of, known stopover sites or known staging sites here in the Chicago region yet. I bet it's coming. But then, as soon as you get some cold weather, maybe your first snow and a nice northerly, not the southerly, the northerly, they'll take off and they'll come down. And then they go to the stopover site, and in our region it is Jasper Pulaski. You'll get 15,000 birds there and see them all at once. And then after that, they fly off, and their family groups take off, and then they just disperse. And it's interesting because the light wing aircraft that would follow them were so from the ground for years people always thought, well, they have this J pattern of flight at night, and there must be some hardwired thing. Well, what it is, once the people were up in the air with them, it's like, oh, they see water, and then they turn. So, they're cueing in on wetland habitats once they get south of the staging areas. But they learn from their parents where those staging and where those stopover sites are. So that's why they persist. So there's going to have to be some breakout bird that's going to go, okay, we're going to come to Cook County and hang out here.
Other questions?
I have several questions. First, what's going on with the robins? I've just seen like 20 robins today migrating. I dropped my baby off in Riverside, and there was 20 robins in a tree, and then I came home tonight, and there was like 10 in my yard. And I haven't seen a robin in like weeks.
Okay, so so this is the time of year where they're flocking up, and these could be all young birds.
They are, yeah.
And they're coming through. These were ones that were born and raised up north,
Right.
or were breeding up north, and in fact, parents are often long gone, and we've already seen them come through. So these are babies in big groups. It's interesting that in North America, the largest biomass of birds is robins. Second, or maybe tied, is what?
Sparrows.
No, not sparrows. It's the juncos. It's the juncos. And for a while, I think in our region, as I recall, I'd heard that at least in the woodlands, it was the red-eyed vireo. But robins are attracted to the savanna-type habitat that we create in our parklands, and we have a lot here in the Chicago region. But then they also breed up in the northern boreal forests.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I put up a Squirrel Buster Plus in my backyard, and I started out with house finches, which seemed to live there. They like loved it. But now I just have like 30 or 40
Grackles?
sparrows.
Oh, sparrows.
That are just posted. They are just hanging out. Is there anything I should do about that?
No.
Okay.
Enjoy. There'll be others that come through and use it as well.
I just have a comment. I have a number of very large hackberry trees. And as a result, I have herds of robins that live in my yard. And starting at this time of year, they're eating the berries off the hackberries. And a number of the males stay. And they when they can make it, they overwinter, and they're eating those hackberries,
Yeah.
much to the detriment of my cars.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, those fruiting trees, it's amazing. How many people have service berries in their yards? So that's a great attractant for the cedar waxwings. That, you know, they'll just take that over if the robins haven't gotten everything first. So cedar waxwings are obligate frugivores, meaning they absolutely live on fruit. That's all they eat. When they're feeding babies, they're going to collect insects to feed babies, but they live on fruit. Robins are very frugivorous, but they'll eat other things as well.
A couple comments and then a question. It's just fun and interesting when you're working just several feet from the bird feeder and the birds could care less. But as soon as you look at them, they all fly away. Just a fun fact, you can buy a bird house with the movable door. So with the hole on top for the the summer, and the hole on the bottom for the winter. And on Urban Nature, which is a show on WTTW, if you watch it, they have those windows with the the UV light in it, and I hope those
with
come
the
pretty
rotate.
soon. And my question is, bird feeder cleaning, how often? Can you use vinegar instead of bleach? What are you protected from mites, viruses, mold, all of the above?
Well, the bird feeders, I think most people would say if you can use vinegar, use vinegar. Bleach is going to have a residue, even if you dilute it at the 1/20th.
Vinegar, I guess the question is how often and why?
Why?
Yeah, I mean, what's the main thing you're trying to?
So what is happening with bird feeders, particularly with the finches, is there's a bacterium that's being passed, and as they stick their head into the feeder, they're wiping their eyes on the round opening of the feeder, and this is what I understand anyway, that the birds can pass this bacterium between each other. So the vinegar, more of a fungicide, but it's a good cleaner, it's a good basic cleaner, just helps reduce that persisting on your feeder.
And
It's
so
also really good to rest your feeder, kind of like, well, just wash them and just let them sit out in the sun with nothing in them, where a bird wouldn't come get them. Let UV do its good work.
And so, Melinda, how often were you saying to do that vinegar thing?
Well, I'd say probably twice a season if you could.
Okay.
At what point in the spring is it okay to cut down the coneflowers and grasses that you so artistically left behind?
How many do it in as early as February or March?
Late March.
Late March? April? May?
Depends on the weather.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and your time. Birds are still going to be utilizing it, but in spring, they're looking for bugs. So, I mean, in reality, you really could take it down, be fine.
Any other questions?
This is somewhat related to birds, but I do feed the birds in my yard, as does a friend of mine. And it seems to attract wildlife, which is fine with me, but a skunk keeps visiting, and my neighbors have complained because their small dog got skunked. Is there a way to deter a skunk from coming if you're feeding the birds humanely without,
Oh, did everybody hear that gnarly question?
Quick question. I see a skunk in my neighborhood, everyone from Chicago, and my neighbors, I think they put food out.
We all have skunks, just that we all don't see them. And if your neighbor has
My dogs have been skunked 6 times this spring.
this is a phenomenon that is just fascinating in Cook County. We've created, much like with the robins, we've created this perfect habitat for robins with our parklands. Well, our houses and our decks are perfect habitat for skunk. And the skunk population has just exploded, even though our coyote population is big. You know, they're just doing really well, and they are being supplemented by bird feeding. You know, the stuff that falls off your bird feeder, etc. You know, we're just going to have to learn to live with them, and that's a really interesting conversation you're going to have with your neighbors for a long time.
Well, I did give them a printout about
Yeah.
skunks and that they really won't bite. It's just if they're bothered.
Right.
But I don't think they're too fond of the idea of having a skunk as a neighbor. But okay.
Right. It's
really
a
no natural deterrent to put.
right. And the thing is people think, well, then I'm going to call animal control and they're nuisance wildlife and they're going to remove them. Well, then the guy across the street's going to move in and take over that now open habitat.
And I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next question. Let's say we
Oh.
we had a ton of warblers come through in the spring. It was fantastic. Do they migrate differently in the fall? Should we expect to see the same volume in the fall, or do they go somewhere else?
The fall migration is so different than the spring migration. The spring migration is so tied to photo period, and again that sort of hardwired hit the phenology of the trees. In the fall, the birds are responding to different cues depending on the species, so it's variable. Often the adults are leaving first if it's not like sandhill cranes where they fly together as a family. The adults have expended a huge amount of energy producing these babies and feeding these babies, and then once they're fledged, it's kind of like, okay, you're on your own. Well, actually, what you'll see in your yard is, if you have wrens, is parents are feeding the babies as they're bouncing around on the ground and just getting started, but pretty soon they're like, see ya, I have another brood to take care of, and they nest again, and those babies are off. So north of us, that same stuff is happening, and so the timing is just so different as these birds are moving south. The other thing about those beautiful warblers that we see in their brilliant breeding plumage, the males' breeding plumage, is they all look like females when they come back. and they've lost their testosterone, and which is tied to their coloring up. And so when they're coming through, you're going, oh, that's and it's really, that's and you don't know what it is. Or some people, very good birders, know what they are. I do not know what they are. Unless it's a red start, I would struggle with warblers. Red starts and ovenbirds.
A couple more questions, anybody? Over here.
We have a catbird that comes and nests next to our back door. And so we are anxious to see the little ones. But somehow the bird disappears. So I don't know what happens. I mean, it's there for a while and then it's gone. So we never see the little ones.
Do you think that the nest was successful? Did you see eggs in it?
Well, it's too high up.
Oh,
so.
okay. Well, birds are really secretive when babies leave the nest. They don't make a big deal about it. In fact, a lot of it's done, at the break of dawn, and they're off and skittering away, and you don't get to enjoy it. There's some birds, like for me, I'll see baby robins, I'll see baby cardinals. I have seen the occasional baby catbird, but just being in the right place at the right time. But the birds, they're really protective of their young, so they're going to probably make it hard for you to see the big fledge.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm enamored with great blue herons, and we have so many now. So I just have questions about those. I'm hopeful this is true, that we're seeing so many of them. I know that just is
my
beautiful.
totem bird.
Beautiful. That it's a reflection of the health of the river, perhaps, that we have so many? Okay, that's great. And then I see them spaced out. They seem to have their, territory. So could you tell me a little bit about their territory and their relationship with what I think are egrets that they seem to not get along with along the river? Or I'm seeing white. At first I thought they were juvenile, but I do think they're actually egrets instead of on the river as well, like big white, but they're kind of the same size, but they're white.
It's a great egret.
So do they not get along?
Well, they're competing for the same food source, so no.
Okay. And what's their territory? How's that work as far as their territory?
It's not really a territory. They're basically they're separating themselves out in an environment that's rich with food, and they're basically trying to partition the environment in a way that they're all going to succeed, or at least they're going to succeed, in the space that they're found. So if a bird comes too close, they're going to chase them off, whether it's another great blue heron or it's a great egret, or have people been seeing the baby night heron, the down here? Yeah, the black-crowned night heron's been hanging around. So they just make, this is, I'm foraging here, you go find another patch. There's plenty of fish in the river, sort of thing. So they, tendency to keep the others away breaks down when they're in a nesting colony. And this is where their breeding hormones and all sorts of things override their natural tendencies to say, keep your distance. But when they are on foraging grounds, they're going to defend their place to eat.
One more question. Anybody? Oh, you have the last question.
A dumb question, but why do we see, or I think there's seagulls in grocery store parking lots? Yeah, I mean, I know people throw them French fries and stuff, but don't those belong by the water?
Well, so we're talking about gulls here, a really interesting and diverse family of birds. And lots of people think about gulls as seagulls, and gulls are actually in every kind of habitat except for perhaps the mountains. And what we have here in the Chicago region is an inland water gull, and they're basically a land bird. They nest on land, and they feed on land, and they're very opportunistic in the way they feed. They do a lot of scavenging, and depending on what's been left on the parking lot, they're probably scavenging for food. They do not need to be by a body of water, and they're very adaptable, versatile, successful birds, and very beautiful when you actually look at them.
Is he talking about Canadian geese? Because they're so tame, you can walk right by them, they don't run away.
Yeah, Canada geese are. Yeah. So the Canada geese populations here are robust. They are not. They're not flying south the way they typically did before, because they're finding that they can. There's open water and ability to feed year-round. A lot of the commercial, like corporate parks and what have you, that would make those detention ponds are finding that is like the perfect geese magnet. So through better design and natural design, they're bringing that sort of deep pond concept and getting rid of it and bringing it to shallow ponds with lots of vegetation around the edge, which they don't care for as much. Yeah.
Quick question, is the heron still in the area if we were to walk by the river?
They are.
Well, I'm sorry, what was the question?
The herons.
Okay. Okay, I think Melinda will be here for a few minutes.
Sure.
If you have a couple other questions, let's give her a hand.
Thank you.